The black sedan pulls up to the curb just after dawn, its tires crunching against the frost-covered asphalt of a quiet suburban street in upstate New York. Detective Sarah Chen steps out into the November cold, her breath forming clouds in the morning air as she watches her partner check the address one more time. This is it. The house looks ordinary, almost disappointingly so. White siding, a neatly trimmed lawn gone dormant for winter, a basketball hoop over the garage. The kind of place where families gather for barbecues in summer and kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on. The kind of place where neighbors wave to each other and nothing terrible ever happens. Except something terrible did happen here 19 years ago, just 3 blocks away, and the man sleeping inside this ordinary house knows exactly what that terrible thing was. Behind Chen, 4 more vehicles pull up, silent except for the soft rumble of engines. No sirens, not yet. They've waited nearly 2 decades for this moment. They can wait another few minutes to do it right. Chen's hand rests on her badge as she approaches the front door, and she thinks about a 17-year-old girl named Samantha, who never got to see another November morning, who never got to grow old enough to own a house like this one, who never got the chance to become anything more than a memory in a cold case file that sat in a storage room gathering dust, while the man who killed her lived his life 3 blocks from where she died. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and it helps ensure that cases like Samantha's never truly go cold. The arrest that November morning in 2024 sent shockwaves through the community of Fairhaven, New York, a small town 40 miles north of Albany, where everyone knows everyone and secrets are supposed to be impossible to keep. But someone had kept a secret for 19 years. Someone had walked past Samantha's memorial every time they drove down Route 9. Someone had seen her mother's face age with grief at the grocery store, at the pharmacy, at the town hall meetings where she begged for anyone with information to come forward. Someone had lived with what they'd done, had slept in their own bed every night while Samantha's bed sat empty in her parents' house, preserved exactly as she'd left it on the night of October 14, 2005. The breakthrough came quietly, the way most modern forensics miracles do. Not with dramatic confessions or deathbed revelations, but with data points and genetic markers processed through algorithms that didn't exist when Samantha died. The Cold Case Unit had submitted the evidence to a genetic genealogy database in early 2024, part of a statewide push to revisit unsolved homicides using technology that had cracked cases everyone thought would never see justice. 3 months later, the computer found a match. Not a direct match, but close enough. A third cousin who'd submitted DNA to trace her Irish ancestry had inadvertently provided the thread that would unravel everything. The genealogist worked backward through birth records and marriage certificates and census data, building a family tree that narrowed and narrowed until only a handful of names remained. One of those names lived in Fairhaven. One of those names had been interviewed briefly in 2005 and cleared. One of those names had been hiding in plain sight. Samantha Moore was 17 years old in the fall of 2005. A high school junior with her whole future mapped out in the way teenagers do when they still believe the world will cooperate with their plans. She wanted to study marine biology at SUNY Stony Brook. Fascinated by the ocean despite growing up hours from the nearest coastline, her bedroom walls were covered with posters of sea turtles and coral reefs, and she'd spent the previous summer working double shifts at the local ice cream shop to save money for college applications and a trip to the Florida Keys she was planning with her best friend Rachel. She was the kind of girl teachers loved, the kind who stayed after class to help clean up the lab equipment, and who always remembered to hold the door for the person behind her. Her laugh was loud and unself-conscious, the kind that made other people want to laugh too, even if they'd missed the joke. She wore her brown hair in a perpetual ponytail and had a collection of hoodies from every 5K run she'd completed with her dad, who'd gotten her into running when she was 12 and struggling with anxiety. Running helped, she told her mom. It made everything quiet in her head for a while. Fairhaven wasn't the kind of town where terrible things happened. It had 2 traffic lights, 1 high school, 3 churches, and a main street that still had a video rental store that somehow stayed in business long after Blockbuster collapsed. The biggest crime in recent memory had been when someone spray-painted the water tower in 2003, and even that had been more funny than frightening since they'd written "Go Spartans" in school colors the night before the homecoming game. People left their doors unlocked. Kids walked to school alone. Friday nights meant football games and diner food afterward, and everyone knew which booth belonged to which group of friends. Samantha's family had lived there for 3 generations. Her grandfather had worked at the paper mill before it closed in the 90s. Her mother taught 3rd grade at the elementary school Samantha had attended. Her father managed the hardware store on Main Street, where half the town came not just for supplies, but for advice on fixing whatever had broken that week. They were woven into the fabric of Fairhaven in the way that only longtime residents can be, present at every town meeting and church potluck and school play. They were safe there. They belonged there. They never imagined that belonging wouldn't be enough to protect their daughter. October 14, 2005, was a Friday, the kind of autumn day that makes upstate New York feel like the most beautiful place on earth. The leaves were at peak color, brilliant reds and oranges and yellows that tourists drove hours to photograph. The air had that crisp apple cider quality that made everything feel full of possibility. Samantha had worked the closing shift at Scoop's ice cream shop, a seasonal job that was winding down as temperatures dropped and business slowed. She'd complained good-naturedly to her coworker Jenny about having to work Friday night instead of going to the football game, but she needed the money, and the owner, Mrs. Patterson, had promised her a bonus if she stayed through the end of the season. They closed at 9 o'clock. Samantha helped Jenny wipe down the counters and mop the floor and lock up the register. Mrs. Patterson had left at 8, trusting the girls to close up properly like she did every week. Samantha and Jenny walked out together at 9:15, their breath visible in the cooling air, their sneakers crunching on the gravel parking lot behind the shop. Jenny's boyfriend was waiting in his truck to give her a ride home. He offered Samantha a lift, but she declined, like she always did. She lived only 8 blocks away. It was a straight shot down residential street she'd walked her entire life. She had a phone. She'd be home in 15 minutes. Jenny watched Samantha wave goodbye and head south on Maple Street, her ponytail swinging, her Fairhaven track hoodie bright red under the streetlights. That was the last time anyone who loved Samantha saw her alive. Her mother, Linda, started worrying at 9:45. Samantha should have been home by 9:30 at the latest. Linda called her cell phone. It rang and went to voicemail. She called again. Same thing. By 10 o'clock, Linda was standing on the front porch, staring down the street, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Her husband, Tom, tried to be reasonable. Maybe Samantha had stopped at Rachel's house. Maybe her phone battery died. Maybe she'd run into friends and lost track of time. But Linda knew. Mothers always know. Something was wrong. Tom got in the car and drove the route Samantha would have walked, slowly, his high beams cutting through the dark, scanning the sidewalks and yards and alleys. Nothing. No sign of her. No red hoodie. No ponytail. No Samantha. They called Rachel's house. Rachel hadn't seen her since school. They called Jenny. Jenny's voice got small and scared when she realized Samantha never made it home. By 10:30, the Moores were at the police station, trying to file a missing person report, trying to make the desk sergeant understand that their daughter didn't run away, didn't have a secret boyfriend, didn't have any reason to disappear. She was 17 and responsible, and she'd just vanished somewhere between the ice cream shop and home on 8 blocks of street where nothing bad ever happened. The search began at first light Saturday morning. Volunteers gathered at the high school parking lot, splitting into groups, fanning out across Fairhaven with photocopied flyers showing Samantha's junior year school picture. She looked young in it, younger than 17, her smile bright and unguarded. The police brought in dogs. The dogs led them to a wooded area behind the old railroad tracks on the eastern edge of town, a place where teenagers sometimes went to drink beer and smoke cigarettes away from adult eyes. The dogs stopped at a culvert where a small creek ran under the tracks, the water shallow and choked with fallen leaves. That's where they found her. Samantha was lying on her back, her red hoodie soaked through with creek water and blood, her eyes closed like she was sleeping except for the ligature marks around her neck and the defensive wounds on her hands that said she'd fought hard to stay alive. She'd been strangled. The medical examiner would later determine she'd died sometime between 9:30 and 11 on Friday night, probably within an hour of leaving the ice cream shop. She'd been dead for less than 12 hours when they found her, 12 hours while her parents didn't sleep, 12 hours while volunteers made coffee and organized search grids, 12 hours while her killer went home and washed their hands and pretended to be human. The news spread through Fairhaven like a wildfire through dry grass. By noon Saturday, everyone knew. The girl who wanted to study sea turtles was dead. The girl who held doors for people and laughed too loud and ran 5Ks with her dad was gone, murdered, strangled, left in a creek bed like she was nothing. The town that prided itself on being safe, on being the kind of place where kids could walk home at night, shattered into something else entirely. Parents kept their children inside. Women stopped going out after dark. Doors that had never been locked got deadbolts installed. Fairhaven learned overnight that belonging somewhere didn't protect you from evil. That knowing your neighbors' names didn't mean you knew their hearts. That terrible things could happen anywhere, even in places where autumn leaves fell like confetti and everyone waved at everyone else and nothing was supposed to go wrong. Samantha Moore was dead at 17, 8 blocks from home, and someone in their small town knew exactly why. The crime scene at the culvert behind the railroad tracks became the center of everything that gray October morning. Yellow tape cordoned off an area roughly 50 yards in diameter, fluttering in the wind that carried the smell of decaying leaves and cold water. Detective Marcus Holland had been with the state police for 23 years, had worked homicides in Albany and Syracuse, had seen things that kept him awake at night. But finding a 17-year-old girl discarded in a creek bed in a town where the biggest crime was usually vandalism made his SS stomach turn in a way the city murders never had. This wasn't supposed to happen here. The girl's red hoodie was visible from the railroad tracks above, a splash of color against the brown and gray of the creek. Holland stood at the edge of the tape watching the forensic team work, photographing every angle, collecting every fiber and hair and trace of evidence they could find. The ground was soft from recent rain, which meant footprints. They found several sets leading to and from the culvert, but the area was a known hangout spot, so separating relevant prints from background noise would be nearly impossible. They found a partial tire track on the access road that ran parallel to the tracks. They found cigarette butts and beer cans, but most looked old, weathered by multiple rainstorms. They found Samantha's cell phone 15 feet from her body, its screen shattered like someone had stepped on it or thrown it against the rocks. The medical examiner arrived at noon and confirmed what Holland already knew. Ligature strangulation, manual strangulation before that, judging by the bruising pattern on her neck, petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes, defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She'd fought hard. There was tissue under her fingernails that would need to be analyzed, skin cells she'd scraped from her attacker's arms or face or neck. There was no evidence of sexual assault, which surprised Holland and also didn't. Sometimes it wasn't about that. Sometimes it was about power or rage or silence. Sometimes people killed for reasons that made sense only in the darkest corners of their own minds. The timeline was tight. Samantha left the ice cream shop at 9:15. The medical examiner estimated time of death between 9:30 and 11. That gave them a 90-minute window and 8 blocks of residential streets where someone had intercepted her. Had she known her killer? Had someone offered her a ride? Had she been grabbed off the sidewalk, dragged into a vehicle, driven to the culvert? The forensic evidence would tell them more, but evidence took time to process, and Holland knew that the first 48 hours were critical. After that, memories faded and trails went cold and killers got comfortable. The interviews started immediately. Holland and his team set up in a conference room at the Fairhaven Community Center and brought people in one by one. Jenny from the ice cream shop, still crying, still blaming herself for not insisting Samantha take the ride home. She described those last few minutes in detail. Samantha had seemed normal, happy even, talking about the marine biology program at Stony Brook and whether she should apply early decision. Nothing in her demeanor suggested she was afraid or expecting to meet anyone. Mrs. Thibault Patterson, the shop owner, confirmed that Samantha and Jenny closed alone every Friday. She'd left at 8 like always, trusted the girls to lock up properly. They interviewed Rachel, Samantha's best friend, who dissolved into sobs when Holland asked if Samantha had any enemies, anyone who'd been bothering her, any unwanted attention from boys or men. No, Rachel said. Everyone loved Samantha. She was kind to everyone. She didn't have a boyfriend. She wasn't interested in dating yet, too focused on college and running and saving money. Holland made a note of that. Sometimes kindness was misinterpreted. Sometimes rejection sparked violence in people who couldn't handle being told no. They interviewed Samantha's track coach, her teachers, her co-workers, her neighbors. They interviewed the boys on the football team she tutored in biology. They interviewed the man who ran the convenience store on Maple Street where Samantha sometimes stopped for gum or a sports drink. Everyone had the same story. Samantha was lovely, responsible, ambitious. No enemies, no drama, no secret life that anyone knew about. Holland found that frustrating and also sadly common. Victims were often exactly what they seemed to be, good people in the wrong place at the wrong moment, crossing paths with someone whose darkness they never saw coming. The neighborhood canvass turned up a few potential witnesses. An elderly woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who lived on Maple Street, said she'd been watching television with her window open around 9:30 Friday night and heard a girl's voice, maybe arguing or calling out, but it was brief and she couldn't be sure. She hadn't looked outside. Hadn't thought anything of it until the police came knocking Saturday afternoon asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. A teenage boy 2 blocks from the ice cream shop said he'd been shooting hoops in his driveway around 9:20 and saw a dark-colored sedan drive past slowly, but he couldn't remember the make or model and didn't get a plate number. It was just a car. Cars drove past all the time. The forensic results started coming back in pieces over the following week. The DNA under Samantha's fingernails was male, not a match to anyone in the criminal database. That was both promising and devastating. Promising because it meant they had the killer's genetic profile. Devastating because if he wasn't in the system, the DNA was just numbers on a screen until they had a suspect to compare it to. The partial fingerprint they lifted from Samantha's cell phone was too smudged to be useful. The tire track could have belonged to any one of 1,000 similar vehicles. The cigarette butts at the scene were tested, but none contained DNA matching their suspect profile. Holland felt the case starting to slip through his fingers like water through a sieve. They had evidence but no direction. They had a victim everyone loved, but no one who wanted to hurt. They had a small town full of people who all claimed to be cooperative, but nobody had seen anything, heard anything, knew anything useful. Then the rumors started. Small towns run on gossip even in the best of times, and murder turned Fairhaven into a pressure cooker of suspicion and paranoia. People whispered about the quiet man who lived alone on the edge of town and worked nights at the warehouse. People pointed fingers at the 23-year-old who dropped out of college and moved back home and sometimes talked to himself at the bus stop. People remembered that teenager who'd seemed too interested in Samantha at track practice, the one who always found excuses to talk to her. Holland investigated every lead, every whisper, every name that came up. The quiet man had been at work the night Samantha died. His time card confirmed it. The 23-year-old had been at his parents' house watching a movie, and his alibi checked out. The teenager from track practice had been at the football game with a dozen witnesses. None of them matched the DNA profile. None of them had scratches or defensive wounds. None of them owned a dark sedan. Holland felt the investigation fracturing into 1,000 dead ends. The funeral was held on a Wednesday at St. Sean, Michael's Catholic Church, the same church where Samantha had been baptized as an infant and made her first communion in a white dress her grandmother had sewn by hand. The church couldn't hold everyone who wanted to come. People stood in the parking lot and lined the street and brought flowers by the hundreds until the steps were covered in bouquets and teddy bears and handwritten notes from classmates and teachers and strangers who'd been following the story on the news. Linda Moore sat in the front pew wearing dark sunglasses because her eyes were so swollen from crying she could barely see. Tom Moore held her hand so tightly his knuckles were white. Samantha's younger sister Emily, only 14, stared at the closed casket and tried to understand how her big sister, who'd been teaching her to drive stick shift in the high school parking lot just 2 weeks ago, was inside that polished wooden box and would never teach her anything else ever again. The priest talked about God's plan and eternal peace and reunion in heaven, but his words felt hollow, empty platitudes that couldn't touch the raw agony of parents burying a child. Holland sat in the back of the church watching everyone who attended. Killers sometimes came to their victims' funerals. Sometimes they couldn't help themselves, drawn to the grief they caused like moths to flame. He studied faces, looking for someone who seemed too calm or too satisfied or too interested. He saw only genuine sorrow and shock and a community trying to process the unprocessable. The weeks turned into months, and the investigation stalled. Holland interviewed over 200 people. He followed every lead, chased every tip that came in through the hotline the police had set up. Someone called to report seeing a suspicious man at the convenience store a week before the murder. The man turned out to be a traveling salesman from Pennsylvania who'd never been to Fairhaven before or since. Someone else called to say their ex-husband was acting strange and might know something. The ex-husband had been in Florida visiting his mother when Samantha died. The tips kept coming, but none of them led anywhere. The DNA profile sat in the database waiting for a match that never came. The case file grew thicker, filled with reports and witness statements and forensic analyses that all pointed to the same maddening conclusion. Someone had killed Samantha Moore. They had his DNA, they had trace evidence, they had a general timeline and a location and a victim who'd fought back hard enough to mark her killer. But they didn't have a name, they didn't have a face, they didn't have enough. By the time 2006 arrived, the case was effectively cold. Holland still worked it when he could, still reviewed the file every few months looking for something he'd missed, some connection he'd failed to make. But new cases piled up. Budgets got tight. The state police needed him in Albany more than they needed him camping out in Fairhaven chasing ghosts. He promised the Moores he wouldn't give up. He meant it. But promising wasn't the same as solving, and every year that passed without an arrest felt like another betrayal of the girl in the red hoodie who just wanted to walk home from work on a Friday night. The town slowly returned to something resembling normal, though normal would never be the same. Parents still watched their children more carefully. Women still felt that prickle of unease walking alone after dark. Doors stayed locked. Security cameras appeared on houses that had never needed them. Samantha's memorial stayed at the edge of the railroad tracks, maintained by volunteers who replaced the flowers and kept the photos clean and made sure no one forgot. But people did forget. Or at least they moved on, because human beings can't sustain that level of fear and grief indefinitely. Life continued. Seasons changed. Classes graduated without Samantha. Her friends went to college, got jobs, got married. The world kept spinning. Linda Moore never moved on. She kept Samantha's bedroom exactly as it was. The sea turtle posters still on the walls, the college brochures still stacked on the desk, the running shoes still by the door. She visited the memorial every Sunday after church, rain or shine, bringing fresh flowers and sitting on the ground talking to her daughter about everything and nothing, the small things mostly. What Emily was doing in school, how Tom's knees were bothering him, how the azaleas bloomed early this year. She talked to Samantha like she was still there, still listening, still interested in the mundane details of life that continued without her. Tom threw himself into work, spending longer hours at the hardware store because being busy meant not thinking, and not thinking was the only way he could function. Emily grew up in the shadow of her murdered sister, watching her parents age with grief, carrying the weight of being the daughter who survived. The Moores became fixtures at every cold case awareness event, every fundraiser for forensic technology, every legislative hearing about victims' rights. They made Samantha's case impossible to ignore. They were tireless advocates for other families still waiting for answers. But advocacy didn't bring arrests. Media attention didn't produce suspects. And year after year, the DNA that should have solved everything just sat in a database, a string of genetic code without a name attached. Holland retired in 2015 after a minor heart attack convinced him and his wife that it was time. He handed Samantha's case to a younger detective named Mike Reyes, who just transferred from the Bronx and wanted to make a difference. Reyes reviewed everything, brought fresh eyes to old evidence, but came to the same dead end. The DNA didn't match anyone in the system. Without genetic genealogy databases that wouldn't become widely used for another few years, without the technology that would eventually crack seemingly unsolvable cases, the DNA was just a locked door without a key. Reyes kept the file active, kept it near the top of his stack, but active didn't mean progress. It meant waiting, hoping, believing that someday, somehow, science or circumstance would change and the door would open. The Moores waited too. They waited through anniversaries that got harder instead of easier. They waited through Emily's high school graduation that Samantha should have attended. They waited through marriages and grandchildren Samantha would never meet. They waited because waiting was all they had left. Waiting and hoping and refusing to let their daughter become just another cold case file gathering dust in a storage room where forgotten victims went to disappear. The breakthrough came quietly on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, almost 19 years after Samantha Moore's body was found in that culvert behind the railroad tracks. Detective Mike Reyes was sitting at his desk, drinking his third cup of coffee and reviewing a stack of reports, when his computer chimed with a new email. The subject line read, "Genetic genealogy, match Moore case." And for a moment Reyes just stared at it, afraid to open it because he'd been disappointed too many times before. The cold case unit had submitted Samantha's DNA evidence to a genetic genealogy database 6 months earlier as part of a statewide initiative to revisit unsolved homicides using technology that had revolutionized forensic science. The process was slow and meticulous, building family trees from genetic matches and tracing lineages through birth certificates and marriage records and census data. Most submissions took months to yield results. Many yielded nothing at all. But this email was from Dr. Card. Catherine Walsh, the forensic genealogist who'd been working Samantha's profile, and the message was short and direct. "We have a viable suspect pool. 3 candidates, all male, all residing in New York. 1 in Fairhaven. Call me immediately." Reyes called. Dr. Walsh explained that they'd gotten a hit through a third cousin match, someone who'd submitted their DNA to trace Irish ancestry and had no idea their genetic information would help solve a murder. From that cousin, Walsh had built a family tree backward and forward through generations, eliminating female relatives and anyone who would have been too young or too old in 2005, narrowing the pool to men of the right age who'd been in the geographic area when Samantha died. 3 names emerged. 1 lived in Buffalo now but had grown up in Fairhaven. 1 had lived in Albany in 2005 but visited Fairhaven frequently because his parents still lived there. The 3rd still lived in Fairhaven, had lived there his entire life, had been there the night Samantha died. His name was David Brennan. He was 41 years old. He worked as an electrician. He'd been married for 12 years and had 2 children. And when Reyes pulled the original case file and searched for Brennan's name, he found it. David Brennan had been interviewed in October 2005 as part of the neighborhood canvass. He'd lived 2 blocks from where Samantha's body was found. He'd told Detective Holland that he'd been home alone that Friday night, that he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. Holland had noted that Brennan seemed cooperative and forthcoming. There had been no reason to suspect him, no scratches or defensive wounds visible during the interview, nothing that raised red flags. Brennan had been cleared and forgotten, just another name in a file full of names. But genetic genealogy didn't forget. Genetic genealogy didn't care about alibis or demeanor or how cooperative someone seemed. It cared about DNA, and the DNA said David Brennan was worth a much closer look. Reyes spent the next 2 weeks building a case that would hold up in court. You couldn't arrest someone based purely on genetic genealogy. The science was solid, but the legal framework required more. They needed to place Brennan's actual DNA at the scene through a direct comparison, which meant getting a sample from him without alerting him to the investigation. Surveillance teams watched Brennan's daily routines. He left for work every morning at 7, drove a white pickup truck, stopped at the same diner for coffee. They collected his discarded coffee cup from the diner's trash. The DNA from that cup was sent to the lab for comparison with the profile from under Samantha's fingernails. The results came back in 5 days. Perfect match, 99.99% probability that David Brennan was the source of the DNA recovered from Samantha Moore's body. Reyes felt his heart hammering in his chest when he read the report. After 19 years, they had him. After 19 years of the Moores living with unanswered questions and unbearable grief, they finally had the man who'd taken their daughter. But having a match wasn't the same as understanding why. Reyes dug into Brennan's background, looking for connections to Samantha, looking for motive, looking for the story that would explain how a 22-year-old electrician with no criminal record had ended up strangling a 17-year-old girl he claimed not to know. What he found was disturbing in its ordinariness. David Brennan had grown up in Fairhaven, graduated from the same high school Samantha attended, though he'd been 5 years ahead of her. He played football, been an average student, gotten his electrician's license at 19 and started working for a local contractor. In 2005, he'd been living in a rental house on Maple Street, the same street Samantha walked home on the night she died. He'd been single then, between girlfriends according to people who remembered him from that time. He'd been described as quiet, a little awkward socially, someone who kept to himself but seemed harmless. That word kept appearing in old interviews, harmless. People always thought monsters would be obvious, that evil would announce itself with visible signs and clear warnings, but David Brennan had been harmless right up until the moment he decided to kill. The question was why. Reyes interviewed people who'd known Brennan in 2005 carefully, without revealing that he was a suspect in Samantha's murder. A former co-worker remembered that Brennan had seemed different after that fall, more withdrawn, jumpier, had lost weight, and wasn't sleeping well. The co-worker had asked if everything was okay, and Brennan had blamed stress from work. Another acquaintance remembered seeing Brennan at a bar in late October 2005, drinking alone. And Brennan had mentioned something about making a terrible mistake but wouldn't elaborate. At the time, nobody had connected these observations to Samantha's murder. Why would they? Brennan had been questioned and cleared. He'd attended Samantha's vigil like half the town. He'd seemed as shocked and saddened as everyone else. But looking back through the lens of guilt, those moments took on different meaning. The weight loss and sleeplessness were conscience and fear. The terrible mistake was murder. The attendance at the vigil was the same impulse that brought so many killers back to admire their work, to insert themselves into the investigation, to feel the thrill of standing among the grieving while knowing what they knew and carrying what they carried. The warrant for Brennan's arrest was signed on November 18, 2024. Reyes wanted to make the arrest at dawn, wanted Brennan disoriented and off balance, wanted to take him before he had time to prepare or run or destroy evidence. The team assembled at 5 in the morning, multiple vehicles, multiple officers, everything by the book, because they couldn't afford mistakes after waiting this long. Detective Sarah Chen joined from the state police, because she'd worked cold cases for a decade and knew how these moments could go wrong. They drove through the dark to Brennan's house, that ordinary white-sided house with the basketball hoop, and as the sun started to rise, they approached the door. Reyes knocked again, called out that they were police with a warrant. A light came on inside. Footsteps. The door opened and David Brennan stood there in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair messy from sleep, confusion on his face that shifted to fear when he saw how many officers were on his porch. Reyes said the words he'd been waiting 19 years to say. "David Brennan, you're under arrest for the murder of Samantha Moore." Brennan's face went white. His mouth opened but no sound came out. His wife appeared behind him, holding their younger child, asking what was happening, her voice rising in panic. The officers cuffed Brennan and led him to the car while neighbors emerged from their houses, standing in their driveways in bathrobes and confusion, watching one of their own being taken away. The news spread through Fairhaven faster than it had the first time 19 years earlier. David Brennan arrested. David Brennan charged with murder. David Brennan, who'd lived among them all this time, who'd wired their houses and fixed their electrical panels, who'd coached Little League and attended town meetings, who'd seemed like one of them because he was one of them. The shock was different this time, more complicated. In 2005, the fear had been of an unknown monster, someone from outside who'd invaded their safe space. Now the fear was worse because the monster had been inside all along, hidden in plain sight, wearing a familiar face. People remembered interactions with Brennan and wondered what they'd missed. His wife gave a statement through her lawyer saying she'd had no knowledge of his involvement, that she was cooperating fully with police, that she was devastated for the Moore family. The statement felt hollow against the magnitude of betrayal. She'd been married to a killer and never knew. She'd had children with someone who'd strangled a teenager and left her in a creek. How did you process that? How did you explain that to your kids? The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Reyes and Chen sat across from Brennan in the small gray room that had seen 1,000 confessions and 1,000 denials. Brennan had lawyered up immediately, which was smart but also limiting because his lawyer kept telling him not to answer questions. But Reyes laid out the evidence anyway. The DNA match, the genetic genealogy, the coffee cup, the timeline, the location, everything that placed Brennan at the scene with Samantha's skin cells under his fingernails. Brennan sat silent, his hands shaking, his eyes red. His lawyer whispered in his ear, but Brennan wasn't listening. Finally, 4 hours in, he started talking. Not a confession exactly, but not a denial either. He said he'd made mistakes. He said he'd been a different person back then, young and stupid and not thinking clearly. He said things got out of hand that night, and he'd been living with it ever since, living with the guilt, the knowledge, the fear of getting caught. His lawyer tried to shut him down, but Brennan kept talking like a dam had broken after 19 years. He said he'd seen Samantha walking home from work and he'd offered her a ride. She'd said no. He'd insisted. She'd been polite, but firm. No, thank you. I'm almost home. He'd driven alongside her for half a block, and she'd gotten uncomfortable, started walking faster. He'd pulled over and gotten out. Tried to convince her it was fine, he was just being neighborly. She'd told him to leave her alone. That rejection, that simple, reasonable refusal, had triggered something in him. Some darkness he didn't know he carried. He'd grabbed her arm. She'd screamed and pulled away. He panicked, afraid neighbors would hear, afraid she'd report him, afraid his life would be ruined over what he told himself was just trying to be nice. He'd put his hand over her mouth. She'd fought. She'd scratched his face and arms and neck, drawing blood, fighting like her life depended on it, because her life did depend on it. He'd squeezed her throat to make her stop fighting, just to make her quiet, just to make her still. He hadn't meant to kill her. That's what he said. He hadn't meant to. But she'd stopped breathing and he'd realized what he'd done, and panic turned to terror. He'd driven her to the culvert, a place he knew from his teenage years. He'd left her there and gone home and washed the blood off and told himself it was a nightmare that would go away if he just acted normal. Except it didn't go away. It never went away. Every time he saw Linda Moore at the grocery store, every time he drove past the memorial, every time October 14th rolled around on the calendar, he carried Samantha with him for 19 years, a ghost that haunted every moment, every smile, every normal day he got to live while she stayed 17 forever. Reyes listened to Brennan's statement and felt no sympathy. The regret seemed real, but regret didn't bring Samantha back. Regret didn't give the Moores their daughter back. Regret was just the price Brennan paid for getting caught. And he'd only paid it because science had evolved enough to reach back through time and pull the truth into the light. Without genetic genealogy, Brennan would have carried his secret to the grave. He would have lived his whole life as a free man, while Samantha stayed in hers. The injustice of that was staggering. The trial was brief. Brennan's lawyer negotiated a plea deal to avoid putting the Moore family through the additional trauma of a full trial. Brennan pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life. The courtroom was packed the day of sentencing. Linda and Tom Moore sat in the front row, older now, their faces marked by nearly 2 decades of grief. Linda had prepared a victim impact statement. She stood at the podium and looked directly at David Brennan and told him about the daughter he'd taken, about Samantha's dreams of studying sea turtles, about the college application she never got to send, about the wedding she never had, and the children she never bore, and the life that was stolen in a moment of violence that Brennan himself admitted was over nothing, over a rejected ride home, over his ego being bruised, over not being able to accept that a 17-year-old girl had the right to say no. Linda's voice broke when she talked about Samantha's bedroom that stayed frozen in time like a museum to loss. She steadied herself and continued. She said that for 19 years she'd lived with questions that had no answers. Who killed her daughter? Why? Whether justice would ever come. Now she had answers, but the answers didn't heal the wound. They didn't bring Samantha back. They didn't give her the years she'd lost to grief. Linda looked at Brennan and said she forgave him not because he deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to hatred would poison what was left of her life. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean Brennan's sentence was enough payment for what he'd taken. Nothing would be enough. The judge thanked Linda for her statement and sentenced Brennan to the maximum, ensuring he'd likely die in prison. The courtroom was silent as they led him away in chains. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed the Moore family. Cameras and microphones and questions shouted from all directions. Reyes stood with them, helping manage the chaos. And when a reporter asked Linda how it felt to finally have justice, she paused for a long moment before answering. She said it felt like setting down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. She said it felt like Samantha could finally rest. She said it felt incomplete because justice for murder was always incomplete, always too late, always a poor substitute for prevention. But it was something. After 19 years of nothing, something felt like everything. Tom stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders and said he was grateful to the detectives who never gave up, to the forensic genealogist who'd built the family tree that led to Brennan, to the technology that had finally evolved enough to reach back through time and solve what seemed unsolvable. BL. He said he hoped other families waiting for answers would see Samantha's case and know that cold didn't mean closed, that time didn't erase evidence, that advances in science were giving voice to victims who'd been silent for decades. The memorial behind the railroad tracks was updated after the sentencing. Someone added a new plaque beneath Samantha's photo. It read, Justice served November 2024, and below that, a quote Linda had chosen from Samantha's favorite book, The Ocean is Everything. It covers 7/10 of the terrestrial globe. Its breath is pure and healthy. It is an immense desert where a man is never alone, for he feels life quivering all around him. Linda said Samantha had loved that quote because it reminded her that even in vast empty spaces, you're never truly alone. Connection exists, even when you can't see it. And in a way, that's what had solved her daughter's murder. Invisible connections through DNA, through family trees, through genetic markers that link strangers across generations and geography. Samantha had been alone in that culvert for 19 years, her case cold, her killer free. But she'd never really been alone. Her parents had carried her. The detectives had carried her. The forensic scientists had carried her. And ultimately, a third cousin who submitted DNA to learn about Irish heritage had unknowingly carried her too, providing the link that connected past to present and gave Samantha her voice back. Detective Reyes visits the memorial sometimes, usually on October 14th when Linda and Tom are there with fresh flowers. He doesn't say much. What is there to say that hasn't been said? But his presence means something. It says that Samantha mattered, that the work mattered, that the 19-year wait wasn't because anyone had forgotten, but because the tools didn't exist yet to catch a killer who'd left nothing behind but microscopic traces of himself under a dying girl's fingernails. Technology caught up to David Brennan. Justice caught up. And a 17-year-old who just wanted to study sea turtles and walk home from work on a Friday night finally got her story told, her death acknowledged, her killer named. The ocean is everything, Samantha had believed. She'd wanted to spend her life studying its mysteries, understanding its depths, protecting its creatures. Instead, she became a mystery herself, a cold case file in a storage room, a question without an answer. But the ocean is patient. It holds everything that falls into it, preserving evidence beneath its surface until the right moment arrives to reveal its secrets. Samantha's case was like that. Waiting, preserved, ready for the moment when science and determination aligned to pull the truth back into the light. And when that moment came, nearly 2 decades late, the truth was exactly what everyone who'd loved her had known all along. She deserved better. She deserved to live. She deserved justice. And finally, imperfectly, incompletely, but unmistakably, justice was what she got.